One of the most curious facets of the human psyche is that, generally speaking, we act with a sense of repulsion to the concept of deformity. When somebody uses the term deformed, it's always in a very sort of negative way, and it sounds very negative. Nobody likes to think of themselves as deformed, and nobody wants to be described as deformed. But at the very same time, pretty much every human on the planet is, in some way, deformed. Take me, for example. Just looking at me here, can you spot the deformities? Well, I've got one on my ear, look. This ear here, it sort of has a straight bit there, leading to a slightly more pointed bit. Whereas on the other side, it's just a sort of nice roundness. And why do I even use the phrase, a nice roundness? Why do I prefer that being rounded, whereas this one is the deformed one? Well, why isn't that one the deformed one? Why isn't that normal and that one the deformed one? Who decides? Another deformity I have on my face is inside my nose. All my life I've found it much harder to breathe out of this nostril than this nostril. And apparently this is quite a common thing. Quite a large percentage of humans have this one. There's a YouTuber I watch who spends most of his videos snorting into his microphone because he has a problem with his sinuses and his nose.
Is the play. Wait, what? That's awful. I see. Yeah.
I can't remember if it was him talking about this or whether when I heard about this I thought about him, but apparently there's this bit of your nose inside there is quite commonly grows incorrectly or non-symmetrically, and so it'll favour one side over the other and make one nostril a pain in the bum, or a pain in the nose I suppose. And this doesn't really have too much of an impact on my life. From a other people perspective, they would never know this by looking at me. But for me personally, it's meant I've had a lot of sleepless nights where one nose just gets completely blocked and struggle breathing, and one of the things you need to get to sleep easily is a nice calm breathing pattern. If you end up breathing through your mouth goes dry, and that's all pretty horrible. And of course it means that I'm a bit of a nose picker. I'm not hunting out bogies, I'm trying to shove the nose in a certain direction to free up the airwaves. And by doing that all the time you occasionally scratch yourself, which causes a scab, and then, you know, it's bleeding noses is quite common, isn't it? And then another deformity just on my face here, another very common one, huge numbers of people have this, is that one eye is slightly lazier than the other. Slightly different shape, whatever. And you don't really notice it unless you're looking. But like you say, I think this one here is slightly lazier than this one here, slightly different positions or whatever. And I don't know whether it's off-putting to anybody or not. I think just the largeness of my eyes is probably more off-putting than the laziness of it. But it's about the symmetry. They say that good looks is all about symmetry. The more symmetrical you are, apparently, the better looking you are. It's not really about any other feature, it's just how symmetrical you are. And so I might at first glance appear quite symmetrical, but there's quite a lot of asymmetry going on with the eye and the ear, and probably lots of other things as well. Another common one that I have, and lots of people have, is I've got a prop here. Here we go. These are my shoes, and not just showing off the label, of course, but that's a good brand, not advertising. But you'll see there, this shoe has no wear on this outside bit, but this shoe's got worn down quite well down that side. And on this side also, this bit here isn't quite as worn down as this bit here. And that's because our legs aren't necessarily the same size as each other. There might be minute millimetres of difference between the size of people's legs, which creates different pressure when they walk. My dad's, for example, is a lot more severe than that. I mean, those shoes, they're about 5 years old and they've done thousands of miles, and so it's only by that very long test, as it were, that the difference begins to show. But with my dad, he can wear the difference very quickly, and it's not prominent, it's not noticeable, but there's enough of a difference in the size of his legs, length of his legs, to mean that, you know, he's always wearing through one shoe quicker than the other. And so eventually, about 10 years ago, a doctor or a chiropodist or somebody gave him a sole to put in the base of his shoe, which a lot of people have. But then, of course, you have to decide which leg is the correct length. Is the deformity that one leg is slightly too long, or is the deformity that one leg is slightly too short? And if everybody had exactly the same difference between one leg and the other, like 1 millimetre or something like that, is it even a deformity? What is classed as a deformity? And of course, everything's a deformity to some unknown benign average, an unwritten rule of what we all consider to be normal. Advertisers often get criticised for putting people in their adverts who are too good looking, and this is a current thing at the moment as well. It's you know, there's a lobby to prevent advertisers from making us think that, you know, we're not beautiful enough by, you know, they present a beautiful person. If you use our product, you too can be beautiful. And apparently it's the problem is unrealistic expectations. But then who's decided that the people in the advert are beautiful? And what is it about them that makes them the least deformed? And with most things, it's going to be just the eye of the beholder. The person watching the advert might not think that person is attractive or particularly attractive, or maybe just a bit bland, or all these other descriptors that don't qualify them to be what the other person who's getting outraged that there's this beautiful person promoting beauty products. They're making an assumption that the person is beautiful based on their opinion of what is beautiful. And, you know, if the person in the advert had 2 pointy ears instead of 2 curved ears, are they then no longer beautiful? Would that person then not criticise that advert. Whereas somebody else who does have two pointed ears probably does find that a more attractive person subconsciously than a person with two rounded ears. And it all gets a bit too pedantic, because what makes somebody beautiful is just a subconscious average of everybody that you've met in your life. Everybody will have a different preference or a different mental average of what normality or beauty is based on their own personal preference and meeting everybody they've ever met in their life. And so I think this whole concept of, criticising beauty or presentations of beauty is a bit misguided, really. That's something that's always happened in human societies. At some point, the person who's most average, for whatever reason, tends to get put on a pedestal as our own, I suppose, marker as to our own individual interpretation of what we consider deformity. Everybody slightly away from that average is sort of like considered a bit deformed. And the whole thing about deformity is it's the scale of deformity, it's the spectrum of it, like most things. There are so many, as I say, sort of different deformities on a human being that most of them just get ignored on a daily basis, apart from in the subconscious, of course. And so we only tend to sort of actually make reference to deformity when it's a dramatic deformity, something dramatically different. Like, I don't know, if I'd have been born with 3 ears, or, the eyes were really dramatically in the wrong place, or I suppose the most common one is people missing limbs, or parts of limbs, something that's immediately noticeable and sort of very pronounced and dramatic. But the problem is that I think the reason we have this criticism of symbols of beauty, symbols of average human looks, symbols of least deformity, when people criticise those for being put front and centre, is that our modern society, the industrial human, relies on conformity of shape in order to mass produce items. And this covers not just clothing and not just living spaces, but work environments and travel methods and all these other things. Like if you're going to manufacture cars, for example, and there used to be a lot of manual cars, somebody with no legs can't operate the pedals. You've got a production line producing cars. 99.99999% of them are going to be bought by people with 2 legs. But that person with no legs is suddenly excluded from this cultural norm. And it's not an intentional exclusion, that's the thing. It's an unintentional exclusion. And then somebody who knows somebody with no legs, the community around the person who has no legs, they're like, well, that's a bit unfair. We're all driving around having a nice time. This poor person with no legs, they can't join in this fiesta. They always have to have somebody else drive them around. And the car manufacturer's in a bit of a bind, because they would quite happily make a car for this person with no legs. But the problem is making that one alternate model is going to cost a huge amount in comparison to the production line that's already in existence for the established model. It's like you're making a unique bespoke car for one individual out of 100,000 or 1 million or whatever it is. And that's very expensive. It's all the manpower required to design it and think about it and produce it in different bits and parts and what have you. And so more often than not, you know, there just won't be a car that's specifically designed for people with no legs, or at least it won't be mass produced. It'll have to be somebody forking out a huge large lump of money for a modification. And that's often why things like charity get associated with deformity, particularly in this modern era, because, you know, it requires that extra money to provide the same thing that everybody else has. The further back you go in time, the less people were actually bothered about deformity, and the more broad their concept of deformity was. If you go back probably about 100 years, maybe 150 years, then in order for somebody to be classed as deformed, they would have to be, you know, so deformed that they're pretty much immobile and, you know, helpless on their own, that require, you know, 24-hour assistance for all their daily needs to keep them alive. And, you know, things like religions have charities specifically for that. That was a very big part of the religious mindset. You know, religions have always felt that everybody's kind of equal, and it's up to society to look after the people who can't look after themselves. And so, you know, there would be like, I suppose, institutions or what have you, where they'd be dedicated to looking after those who were so deformed that they couldn't exist on their own without an extreme struggle, if at all. But very much in the 20th century, as mass production got underway and we had all these different products that are pretty much one size fits all, gradually more and more different types of deformity sort of start being excluded unexpectedly. You know, I was chatting with my brother earlier today and I said, oh, I'm going to put that in my video. You know, we were talking about how fat we were. And, you know, he was in a shop and he finds it very difficult to buy clothes because he's a very tall lad and he's got a bit of a belly. So for him, it's about hunting down how many X's there are on the label, you know. XXL is still a bit tight. It's not a deformity, or is it? You know, that's just the shape he is. Otherwise, he looks perfectly normal, you know. Well, he does look normal. He's just a big version of normal. Anyway, so, yeah, the clothing companies, you know, they mass produce all these clothes. They're not going to mass produce one XXL to put in every single shop. On the other end of the spectrum, ultra smalls, you know, for very, 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 very small people. They're not going to have one tiny version in every single shop, or whatever. Let's say you make I don't know, a shirt or a blouse. You know, how many grades of human size are there that you can mass produce? At some point you'll be mass producing so many different sizes that you might as well, I don't know, go back to tailoring, and every time somebody comes in, make them their own unique piece of clothing specifically designed to their size. And of course, that, again, going back 150 years, that's how it was. You know, people didn't obsess about size because you just went in the clothes shop and the tailor made you the clothing item you wanted, and they measured you up and cut the cloth and sewed it all together. But with mass production, that doesn't happen. You've just got to fit into whatever the mass producer has produced, and they're only going to produce things that generate profits. If you want the bespoke item, again, you have to pay a lot of money for it. And so you bring more people into this concept of exclusion and criticism of average. You could list hundreds of objects that have these things, like, again, in the old days, it's like, you know, left or right-handed scissors, for example. I mean, left and right-handed isn't a deformity, or is it? You know, all this kind of thing. And so this is another thing that's another version of the spectrum that is affecting modern society. And we don't realise it, we don't talk about it, or some people do, but it's very often in a very antagonistic way. There's sort of like this undercurrent of anger that our modern society doesn't cater to what we now refer to as disabilities. What might have once been called a deformity, that it's now changed its name to like disability, so it includes anybody that can't do something that the considered average can do. And this is something in the past that people would just adapt to in their own sort of local communities. It'd always be, little Timmy's been born missing a left arm or whatever. And so all through his life, everybody around him would naturally just adapt to whatever situation little Timmy's in. They would give him jobs that only a one-handed person could do, one-armed person could do. And, at the dinner table, that maybe somebody would cut his food up for him or something, so he can just prong it with a fork. All these, hundreds of little details that people just did naturally. They wouldn't treat Timmy as tiny Tim as somebody who was deformed. He would just be another human in the environment who you have to do specific things for, just as you do specific things for everybody. Like Uncle Joe gets grumpy if you mention taxes, so when he's around, don't mention taxes. We all make accommodations for other people in our lives without thinking about it and automatically. But in the modern society, where everybody's very distracted and people don't really live in communities so much anymore, and it's all very busy and mass-produced stuff and blah 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 blah. Little Timmy's now classed as, a potential charity case or whatever, rather than just being looked after by their community. When people make stuff, they're not considering little Timmy. They're considering the average. It's much more a case of, well, that's just tough luck for little Timmy, isn't it? It's sort of like, good luck with the charities. Hope it all works out for you. And this is something that has become political, when it never used to be much of a political issue, really. 100 years ago, people weren't getting riled up about different people's deformities and whether people were too average or too deformed, or whether people should be catered to or not catered to, because the society was already a very bespoke society. Old society was automatically bespoke. It was very unusual to find two items of anything that were the same. If somebody was born with one arm, then that person's household would just naturally adapt to somebody with one arm. Everything built around the house would be designed with that in mind by the individual who would be changing stuff. Whereas nowadays it's like a struggle, and you have to pay extra for all the stuff that you require for this bespoke. Bespoke costs millions, whereas it used to be the norm. There wasn't enough people who felt excluded, or like society wasn't treating them like human beings enough for them to make a political, a political voice. There wasn't enough people to create a political voice. The charities the religious charities just looked after the people who were, extremely at one end of the far away from average spectrum, and everybody else sort of assisted each other naturally. It's like, whereas nowadays there's so many people with so many little deformities that are like, it's very difficult to get through life without having to think, why is life harder for me? That's not fair. And there's enough of those kinds of people now to create a political voice. And you'll notice over the last 10 years or 15 years particularly, there's been a lot of pressure on industry for what they now term accessibility, and trying to make workplaces suitable for people with various disabilities or deformities. And of course the businesses don't like this because it costs money. And if there's one thing a business doesn't like, it's things that cost money. And it's sort of like become right wing if you think that companies shouldn't bother making going out of their way to assist people who are different, and you're considered left wing if you think that companies should go out of their way to make things easier for people who are too far away from the average. And it's all quite extreme, it's all quite damaging to the national psyche, or the human psyche even. I don't really know how to solve this problem. Well, once it gets political, it all starts getting sort of murky and muddy and aggressive, and you have the the fat ladies getting angry at the supermodels, and the supermodels getting angry at the fat ladies, and the blokes are like, well, obviously I support the supermodels, obviously, apart from some blokes who, because it's now political, they want to be loyal to their political party, they're going to support the fat ladies. And I think it's a massive distraction, really, from real politics. I think the way to solve this isn't to harass people who mass produce items. The answer isn't to harass the unhappy people who are feeling excluded, make memes of them and all that kind of thing. That's the wrong way of going about it. What we have here is a problem that we've created for ourselves in very recent times that we're not adapting to properly. And the answer, although I don't really know, again, I'm not sure, but I think the answer is just a return to the concept of bespoke. Finding a way to mass produce bespoke items. And I think we do have that technology coming along. It's not quite ready yet, but I think that's the next change from the industrial age to the technological age, is that companies are going to be able to mass produce individual things, if that makes sense. Things like with laser printing and AI, and having more clever machines so that they can pump out 400 different sizes of t-shirt, and they can market them online rather than send them all out to shops, and all that kind of. I think we can get there. And I have an issue with this because this has always been a thing I've always found to be very important, because when I was much younger, probably in my teens, maybe 14 or 15, something like that, I fractured my big toe, and it didn't quite it didn't heal fully aligned. It's just slightly bent a little way, and so I can never find a pair of shoes that fit both feet. When I go shopping for shoes, I tend to try out every single pair in the shop and end up picking the pair that just fits me the best. None of them ever fit me, but I just end up picking the pair that fits me the best. And, hope that they don't give me blisters down the line, otherwise I'll have to look for another new pair and go around all the shops trying on all the shoes all over again. And I can't imagine buying shoes online, how that would work. But I really should fork out for a bespoke pair of shoes. But the amount of discomfort I get from having minor issues with my feet never quite equates to the £1,000 or £2,000 necessary to get the bespoke pair of shoes. I always think, no, it's not quite worth it, it's not quite painful enough, I don't quite get enough blisters. So I've always been quite negative about the concept of one size fits all and mass production, and not necessarily being the best thing for humanity. And in the last 10 or 15 years, we're seeing that more and more. And I think we've got to start using technology to take us back in time to where bespoke was normal. Bespoke was average priced. Bespoke was the expectation. But we've got to do it in a way that we're thinking forward, in that we're going to use technology to do that, to adapt our systems to do that. Now, I don't know whether this kind of thing can happen overnight. I've no idea how long it could take to get us to that stage. But I'm very concerned, like with so many topics nowadays, that people are going to argue themselves into oblivion, in that creating this sort of aggressive argument about it will tend to entrench people in their own mental status quo, in that supposedly people on the left are just going to constantly badger businesses to spend outrageous amounts of money making unique bespoke items when they're not ready to, and which eats into their budget to get to the point where they can do that. That will like delay the coming of that age. And the people supposedly on the right wing, or the people, the businesses, the money grabbers, they sort of like just have to keep demonising these people on the left who are as crazy, and making them out to be loonies and all that kind of thing. And by doing that, it sort of like gets them out of having to think about getting to that point where we have more bespoke stuff. Get into the future of bespoke, mass-produced bespoke. I think without the aggression, I think people can get to an agreement. I think people can, just establish the finances of it, agree to the finances of it, and then take it from there. It doesn't need to be a violent argument. It just needs to be a mathematical simulation, really.